Okay, it looks like we are recording. So as people continue to come in, I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of an intro to you guys that are already in here. Glenn, can I get a thumbs up for comms check?
Hey, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Okay, great.
Awesome.
Got you. All right. Welcome to the Connector Series webinar for this quarter. I'm Amanda Green, the event coordinator with CIFIC. Some of you may be familiar with CIFIC, but for those who are not, CIFIC stands for the Cyber Fusion Innovation Center, and we are a 501c3 organization that is part of the DefenseWorks company. Some of you may recognize our sister hubs, SoftWorks, ErticWorks, and HSWorks, just to name a few. Civic specifically is partnered with Arctic, which is the Army Cyber Technology and Innovation Center located in downtown Augusta, Georgia. Arctic is a data-centric laboratory focused on innovation and future cyber capabilities for the Army. It's part of the larger Army Cyber Command, or RCyber, which has its headquarters at Fort Gordon in Augusta. A few housekeeping notes. As you've noticed, we're recording this webinar. Civic will post the recording on our website, cyberfic.org, within 24 to 48 hours. Questions are welcomed and encouraged. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, feel free, but hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Otherwise, please keep your mics muted. Right. And if there are no questions about what we're going to do today, I am going to turn this over to our speaker to introduce himself and get us started. Over to you, Glenn.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. Can you hear me? Is that everything working?
Yep, Lima Charlie.
Awesome. Sounds good. Alrighty. And you guys can see my screen, presumably, hopefully. I guess we can get started now. Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn Parham. I was the Pentagon's former generative AI technical lead. Really happy to be here today. I'm here out of DC. Presumably the weather, or supposedly the weather, is like finally decent today. So maybe after this, get to go outside. But yeah, it's really awesome to be here today. I'll keep the chat open if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation that they'd like to ask me. But yeah, I guess without further ado, we can actually just go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to be talking, and this is going to sound very salacious and like you might roll your eyes, but how to actually prepare the Pentagon for AGI, this artificial general intelligence. So we're going to reflect on the DoD's generative AI task force that I was a part of, and then we're going to kind of talk about the future of bringing AGI to the Pentagon and the DoD, and what we're calling AI government alignment. So yeah, again, the agenda, let's talk about the task force, talk about AGI, and then what the future kind of holds. Throughout the chat or throughout my talk, if you guys have questions, put in the chat and I should be able to address them, or I can, address them at the end as well. So a little bit about me. My name is Glenn. I, again, was a Pentagon's technical lead for generative AI. We were out of the Office of Secretary of Defense's Chief Digital AI Office. My background, software turned AI engineer, data scientist. I led engineering for the Pentagon's, we were called the SWAT team of nerds, the Defense Digital Service, which recently actually, unfortunately, had to shut down. I built and sold a political tech company back in 2020. That's actually what brought me here to DC. Before, I was in San Francisco Bay Area, where I studied data science, computer science, really was just passionate about politics. And here's kind of my journey with generative AI over the past almost like decade, which is kind of insane. So studied data science and natural language processing at UC Berkeley. Again, super passionate about politics. I actually started a whole research organization around this, political computer science. It's actually now one of the largest research organizations at UC Berkeley, which is kind of wild. And back then I was super passionate about applying these maybe just like linear algebra or natural language processing topics to the political world. Not necessarily advocacy, but like, okay, how could we use principal component analysis to model like polarization in congressional bills? Or how can we detect shifts in campaign communications via natural language processing? And this is back like 2017, 2018. I think GPT-2 and GPT-3 started to come online back in like 2019-ish, around that time. And I just saw like so much immense potential, and it was like the most exciting thing, but also kind of terrifying. And over the years, 2020, 2021, I was like, what is the government like? Is the government even aware of this tech of this generative AI of GPT-3 at the time? And so I went to AI.gov, like the website, and the website was down. It was just not functional for like, I think it was like several weeks or months. And that just like did not instill a lot of confidence in me that the government was actually functionally capable or tracking this technology. Coincidentally, at the time, the Pentagon's chief AI office asked me if I wanted to come join. This is back in like 2021, 2022. So I came over and I was like, I never had a military background, but I was like, let me stop complaining from the outside and go see if I can affect change from the inside. So I came to the Pentagon, came to the Defense Digital Service, and started experimenting with LLMs pretty immediately, using LLMs to do, large language models to do language translation tasks, code generation. The models were not good back then, but it was kind of a proof of concept, and no one really cared about it. People would be like, kind of roll their eyes when I would talk about this stuff. And then ChatGPT was launched, and pretty much everything changed in terms of my trajectory in the Pentagon, and what I've been working on the past few years. So, namely, the biggest effort that I worked on while in the Pentagon for 3 years was Task Force Lima. It was the DoD's Generative AI Task Force that ran largely from like 2023-ish to 2024, around 2 years of work. All right, so the history here. ChatGPT is launched in November 30th, 2022. That summer, the following months, a lot of people in DC at the White House and kind of all the way down the chain of command, everyone's talking about AI and ChatGPT, but no one really knows what to do about it. It's just kind of like this lingering thing in the air. And so at the time, the secretary and then the deputy secretary of defense, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, former deputy SecDef, was like, all right, we're going to create a task force because we don't really know what this thing is, but we know we want to, do something about it. So they created Task Force Lima. And the idea was it was supposed to develop, evaluate, recommend, and monitor generative AI across the DoD. Some other kind of milestones that came out of this, Biden's AI executive order, which came a few months out after a Task Force Lima was launched, that came that fall. And then we had the Biden AI National Security Memo last year, and most recently, the Trump AI Action Plan, which was just like 2 weeks ago. And so if I, as I reflect on Task Force Lima, I largely kind of compartmentalize our efforts into these 6 categories: policy, authorization, experimentation, evaluation, scaling, and community. So I'm going to kind of touch on all of these. All right, so Task Force Lima, DoD generative AI policy. So very early on, to us creating Task Force Lima, we knew that people wanted to use generative AI, that people were using things like ChatGPT. So we had to quickly get out of the front door like an interim guidance on using generative AI on, in the military context, because no policy existed. And it was kind of just like the wild, wild west. Sometimes that can be fun, but sometimes that can be a little bit dangerous. So we created this kind of Secretary of Defense level policy that got signed off, where we had very high level blocks about like how you should be using generative AI in DoD. It wasn't overly prescriptive. Again, very, very kind of foundational. Like, don't put top secret SCI into ChatGPT. Things like that, which you would think are very obvious, but we had to do a lot of work to make sure this was federated, making sure that people were assessing risk, that people were holding themselves accountable. We had instances of people being like, well, if I use ChatGPT to generate it, it's not my fault, it's the AI's fault. And it's like, no, we had to codify that at the end of the day, you are held liable and responsible for anything that you use these AI chatbots for, and ensuring that people are properly citing when they're using AI to use it for work and things like that. After that, November 2023, we then had the different military departments come out with their own generative AI guidance policies. It was kind of interesting because some components of the military were more restrictive than others, which kind of seemed arbitrary to me. I was like, why is, I don't know, Army more risk tolerant than Air Force, for example. So that was kind of fascinating. But we started to see more and more DoD policies emerge throughout the Department of Defense. And towards the end of last year, CDAO, the Chief AI Office, came out with this generative AI, responsible AI toolkit, which was like, here's how to use generative AI responsibly in the military domain. This was probably one of the most difficult things we had to tackle, which was how to get an authorization to operate with generative AI. So if you're in DoD, if you're watching this, you may be like very keenly aware of how annoying it can be to have an authorization or to achieve an authorization to operate. It's basically this kind of like stamp of approval that these authorizing officials across government, especially national security, have to give you in order for your software or your system to run. And so we ran into this complication where typically when you're authorizing software, the software is bounded. You're using it for, even if you're using it for AI, for bounded AI tasks, like using AI to analyze and extract objects and satellite images, which is largely a bounded task. But when you're using these large language models in unbounded ways, one LLM that could be used to do like, 10,000 different tasks, how do you authorize that? And how do you convince the authorizing officials across the largest organization on the planet that this is worth authorizing and that the risk isn't so high? Because if you're not able to bound it, like how do the risk could be infinite in theory, right? And so we had to convey that the risk was low enough to authorize use for low stake use cases. So we're not talking about connecting these LLMs to, kinetic systems or, lethal systems. We're talking about using it to streamline paperwork, things like that. And so the kind of dynamic that emerged was basically figuring out how to authorize two different classes of model applications and model types. One were these open weight large language models. So these are primarily, people also call them like open source models sometimes. These are primarily come from companies like Meta. Meta publishes a lot of their Llama series, other families like Mistral. And the idea is it's often easier to get these models authorized and get access to them because we can just pull them from the open internet like immediately. But it can be harder to use because we have to actually run it on our own GPUs, our own compute. And as I'll get into later, this can often be hard to actually get access to. One key moment that was really transformative to the Department of Defense was when we worked with Meta and they granted the US government and by implication the DoD an exemption to use their Llama models in US military domains. Up until that point, Meta is the primary open weight model provider, and they were not allowing any military use. And so we were in this really weird conundrum where we wanted to use the best models, but we also, weren't allowed to legally. So once that happened, I mean, that completely changed the dynamic and allowed the US military to really lean in and authorize the use of the best models that we had access to. And then the other class of models are these closed weight models. Think OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, where they can be harder to get authorized and access to because they're not open source, so not open weight. We can't just pull them off the internet, although OpenAI a couple hours ago just released their first open weight models. But anyways, it can be harder to get these models into the different national air-gapped national security environments at different impact levels. But because a lot of these model services are managed, we don't have to worry about making sure we have the right number of GPUs and the right environments. It like just works, so to speak. But that takes much more effort. And so part of the work that we did was getting the OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google model services authorized in via the different cloud service providers. So OpenAI uses Microsoft Azure, Anthropic uses AWS GovCloud, and so forth. And getting DISA, that's the defense, basically right under the DoD CIO, the entity that authorizes the different software services. You can sort of think of that as we had to work with them and kind of pressure them to authorize these model services to come online at like the unclass level and the secret and TS level and beyond. We also had the kind of experimentation lens of Task Force Lima. So, we were tasked with getting all these different generative AI use cases from the Deputy Secretary of Defense. It's like, okay, go figure out how people are using generative AI across the largest organization on the planet. That, I think, to be frank, had mixed results, because it turns out when you put out like pretty much a Google form to 3 million people, they end up just submitting like the most random ideas, things that they come up with in the shower, not actually representative of like how people are actually using generative AI, but I can get into that later. Really, this is where I excelled, I think, in the Task Force Lima and the work I did. My mentality and the ethos of the Defense Digital Service, we're a team of hackers, Pentagon SWAT team of nerds. And so we believe in learning by doing, building things, trying things out, seeing what works, what fails. So we engage in things like hackathons, with the Bravo series by the Air Force. We created these like generative AI powered robots. You can see the right side of your screen, the bottom right side of your screen. This was powered by multimodal generative AI. In the middle of your screen, you'll see me at DEF CON. I think this was last year, demonstrating connecting and embedding AI agents into radio networks that we experimented with the 18th Airborne and a couple different components of the military. And then lastly, looping in large language models into cyber defense operations, figuring out in the security operations center of different networks where we can best have LLMs actually integrated into their workflow. And as a result of that, like, how can we measure the success? So for example, before, when a cybersecurity incident would happen on a network, it might take a security operations center analyst like 2 hours to write up a report about what happened. With LLMs, it took them like 20 minutes. So that was kind of a meaningful, dramatic increase in performance and a reduction in time. There was also the desire for Task Force Lima to kind of inspect and figure out evaluation and alignment to DoD. There was this realization that we need DoD specific benchmarks. So Scale AI provided some. MilBench was provided by Major Daniel Ruiz out of the Research and Analysis Center, Arms Futures Command. There's MilGlue, which came out of MIT. These are benchmarks that basically are specific to the DoD domain. In the rest of the world, there's something called SWE-Bench, software engineering benchmarks. There are benchmarks for the legal profession. But we realized, like, hey, if we're going to be spending all this money on and using these AI chatbots here, there, and everywhere in the military, well, how is it going to perform in the military? One thing I published a couple of years ago, or a year or two ago, was Axon, the DoD's large language model operations framework. And I'll get into that very briefly. The idea was we could take open weight large language models and fine tune them for DoD domains. And this is the deck that when I first launched Axon, that we presented. So yeah, a series of open weight LLMs fine-tuned on unclassified, publicly available DoD information that we published and hosted on the DoD's Hugging Face, which I was the manager of. And the first one that we published we called Axon 7B policy. The idea was Axon is and was a stack for the DoD to use to help basically manage the way they interface with large language models. So we took DoD issuances. You can think of them as like these high level, like Secretary of Defense level issuances, memos going back, I think back into like the 1940s or something. We would convert that into a synthetic data set that we could create these like Q&A pairs, do something known as supervised fine tuning on GPUs based in combination with these like open weight models, Mistral models. We could host these models and then actually embed them into some sort of like actual chatbot application. So yeah, again, we crawled different parts of the DoD, like WHS.mil, Washington Headquarters Service, and we extracted 80 PDFs, converted this into question answer pairs. So it asks you questions about the DoD policy, things like that. Here's a code. I could go into this more, but we use quantized low ranking adapters to actually do the fine tuning of the model. And then we were able to host it. So that was a framework that we used to. We had a lot of different iterations of this. People bringing different types of DoD data and doing fine tuning operations. So a lot of success there. So another dimension, especially as a technical lead of Task Force Lima, that I was really kind of obsessed with, was figuring out how to scale generative AI. Like from a compute perspective, from a product perspective. One of the questions we had to confront was, should we use the Department of Defense has something known as the HPC MP. It's the DoD's high performance computing center, essentially. Should we be tapping into that, or should we be leveraging, AWS or Azure or the different cloud companies, the compute that they have? There's trade-offs to both sides. And so we actually did a joint partnership with the DoD's HPC MP program, where we deployed Axon, which I just talked about.
Okay.
And we tried to understand, what were the trade-offs to deploying on HPC compute, and learned a lot of lessons there. I think the lessons are CUI, unfortunately, so I can't share them here. But one of the hardest problems that we had to confront was, because the DoD is so decentralized, we have all these different air gap networks, disconnected networks that are not connected to, the internet. You have to kind of premeditate and predict the number of GPUs to allocate across those networks, right? Because once they go into a SCIF, they're not coming out. And that can be really difficult to do in coordination with these private companies, AWS and Microsoft, who see these GPUs and the opportunity cost of them. Do we pay for compute centrally as a chief AI office of the Department of Defense? Do we pass that cost on to the end users or the customers? How do we orchestrate that cost balance? What do we buy? What's the market rate? What's reasonable? What are reasonable prices of what we should buy? I remember on the early days of Task Force Lima, people would be spending like $5 million on these basic AI chatbots. And then some people would be spending like, $10,000. So like there was this massive, disparity or spectrum of what people were willing to pay for like any given AI chatbot. What tools do we need to build internally? People would talk about, we need to have all these sandboxes, and what do we need to scale? And we learned a lot from NipperGPT. Colin, who founded NipperGPT, is one of my really good friends. And we learned from him, exactly what the different constraints and the bottlenecks you'll run into as you scale the DoD's largest AI project ever, which was really exciting. And I'm actually going to be doing an episode on that on my podcast very soon. I think this is the last dimension, last line of effort of Task Force Lima, and that was communicating what the DoD was doing up and out to the rest of the Pentagon, to the White House, different parts of the government. So, that's a photo of me at the White House briefing White House leadership on how the U.S. military was using generative AI, the different use cases that emerged. We had these quarterly sessions where we'd get all the different senior like SESs or 4-stars and whatnot together from the COCOMs to discuss how we were their combatant commands were using AI. One thing that I led that I really loved were I called large language model office hours, where I would gather there was over 200 like DoD AI scientists and practitioners who I'd convene every couple of weeks. And we would just catch up on all the latest advancements, the latest bottlenecks that existed. So, for example, they would complain to me, "Hey, we can't use meta models because there's that prohibition on use on the meta side." And so we took that information and we took action on it. We're like, all right, we're going to go through the right mechanisms to convince Meta to give us an exemption. Or, hey, we want to use the OpenAI models, but we're not authorized to use it. And so we went through the right mechanisms to kind of pressure and yell at the right people in the Pentagon to authorize OpenAI models. And we also did things like engaging with industry. We published a bunch of open source contributions, how to use LLMs at DoD, our Hugging Face account, which has hundreds of members. I think we're one of the largest Hugging Face organizations, things like that. And finally, we had to deliver a final report on Task Force Lima. I will say in retrospect, like the summary or the report was very watered down. I think it was during a very politically sensitive time. It was the towards the end of the Biden administration, turnover with the new administration. So what got out and was actually included in the report, I'm kind of like, I don't know. It was very high level and not super helpful. But basically the tenets of this final report, and you can look this up, just Google Task Force Lima final report, and you can find this, were that there are a lot of operational and administrative use cases. We should experiment more. Things are changing pace very rapidly with generative AI. We need more technical talent and compute. We need to focus on different key pilots, have evals for generative AI, and make the ATO process more efficient. So, I don't know. Like, I feel like ChatGPT could have generated what I just said and probably been more insightful. Here are my takeaways, though, that are kind of like more off the cuff or off the record insights. With Task Force Lima, and over the past few months, I've been advising different states and chief AI officers in different states and governors. I would say here are my main takeaways for when it comes to, generative AI in government, in the military. One is to not overthink your AI rollout strategy. I've just been shocked by sometimes I'll be, I just think people overthink it. They're like, we need everyone to be fully trained. We need to do all these different things. And I'm like, guys, just give your workforce a chatbot and see what happens. And my argument is, hey, if we can do that with NipperGPT, which now has, I heard the latest numbers like 700,000 people. If the U.S. military can use these chatbots at scale, there's no excuse for other parts of government to be scared to use these chatbots. That's my perspective. The next one is the scale and coverage and performance of generative AI is unprecedented. And your mindset has to be different here. Different rules are going to apply, and don't let the past bias you. This kind of comes out of, I think there was a lot of dissent, even at the chief AI office of the Pentagon, where I would just, a lot of people were very, not just, okay, I'll phrase it like this. A lot of people just did not believe in the prospect or the promise of generative AI. They just thought it was kind of a marginal or incremental improvement from a previous generation of AI. And I just don't think that's accurate or fair. Some people even thought that we shouldn't even call generative AI, which I thought was really bizarre. So I guess I'll leave that there. One of the biggest things that all these different chief AI offices across the government are mandated to do is create these like use case repositories. And I'm kind of conflicted here because what typically happens is some, chief AI office is tasked with going across their state, the military, whatever government body, and like basically just having a Google form where people submit these AI use cases. What happens though is that it's not really representative of how people are using AI. It's kind of just what people want, they think you want to hear, sort of thing, if that makes sense. So, for example, when we did this for Task Force Lima, we'd get submissions of people being like, "Oh, we're using AI, generative AI, to like, I don't know, connect to control drones and do all these different things," which was not true. When we'd actually go and follow up and be like, "Oh, you guys are doing this," and they'd be like, "Oh no, it's just an idea we had." But I think this is important because if the whole point is to understand how the military or your government is using generative AI, it needs to be based in like actually analyzing NipperGPT logs and classifying the different tasks they're doing. It cannot just be flashy things that people think you want to hear. Another takeaway is that chief AI offices, they need to clearly articulate what their value proposition is. Are they there to provide funding? Are they there to invest in infrastructure? Like, what are they doing? Because that was the biggest critique that I think that we had as a chief AI office, was like, we are, allocated billions of dollars to spend on these programs. What is the value proposition? Are we actually doing anything to advance generative AI and DoD? Are we going to distribute funds? That I think got muddied and kind of contributed to just a lot of the flack that the deserved flack that we received. A couple more takeaways here. I can promise you this right now. your government workforce is using ChatGPT, whether you like it or not. This was something that very early on to Task Force Lima, I went to DISA and the people who control NIPR, essentially the DoD's unclassified network. And I was like, I want you to run the numbers of how many people are going to ChatGPT every single day. And it ended up being, I think, like 7 to 10% of people on NIPR were going to chatgpt.com. And so as I went around the Department of Defense and people would give me every excuse to not use AI chatbots, I was like, okay, I get you're nervous about it, but guess what? Your workforce, I have the numbers. Here are the logs of people using ChatGPT. Would you rather them use this unauthorized kind of wild, wild west chatbot, or use something that's authorized that we can control and can prevent instill guardrails against? Two more takeaways. Promise I'm almost done with the takeaways. AI policies success metric. AI policies success metric should be how many developers and AI users reference it. I think my biggest critique with a lot of these different AI policies that have emerged over the past couple of years is they're so high level and, to be frank, like unhelpful. Like I don't know. I just get very little use out of them as a developer, as an engineer. I think policy should actually be something that I can build from and leverage. And the policies that I've seen emerge are so high level that they lack substance. And I think we can do better. And lastly, technical people should make and inform technical decisions. You would be surprised at some of these like chief AI offices across governments. Actually, like engineers or AI practitioners are in rare supply. And so we need to actually empower technical people, not just to go build technical products, but like when it comes to policy, they need to be a decision maker in how that policy is crafted. All right. So we talked about Task Force Lima, the path towards artificial general intelligence. What is AGI? Artificial general intelligence, the definition from Google's lab is the intelligence of a machine to possess the ability to understand or learn any intellectual task that a human being can. And AGI, it's not necessarily, Skynet. It's not inherently nefarious. It's also not inherently omniscient. It doesn't know everything. It is not everywhere unless you intentionally make it to be like that. And over the past couple of years, there's been more government discourse about like, hey, if AGI is near, some people believe AGI is very near, what should be the government's response to that as a regular of AGI, but also as a user of AGI? So there was this great interview with Ezra Klein with Ben Buchanan, who was the Biden administration's one of the senior AI advisors. And so, obviously what I'm concerned with is how we can safely bring AGI to the DoD and national security community. And fundamentally, what this should look like is bringing AGI to the Pentagon is building these secure model pipelines from AI labs to the government accredited clouds to the end users across the government. So here's like in an ideal scenario. Here's what that AGI DoD rollout would be over the course of 2 weeks. So an AI lab claims, maybe it's OpenAI, like, hey, we've achieved AGI with whatever latest, O10 model that they've released. The pipeline that would be kicked off soon thereafter would be that model getting into the different DoD networks and impact levels, the DoD being able to verify that this model kind of exceeds performance on a lot of different diverse DoD domains and tasks, and DoD employees actually being able to interact with these models via these pre-existing products very quickly. And so I actually submitted to the White House, I think like 4 months ago now, this kind of 15-page document to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I'm like, I kind of recommended the different things that the Trump administration should be focused on, from an acquisition, an authorization, infrastructure, and a bunch of different perspectives. And I've been pretty excited. The Trump AI's action plan was released about a week or two ago. And a lot of the, what I included in my publication to the White House was able to get in the AI workforce, making sure we're investing in national security, compute, and data centers, making sure that everyone has access to a chatbot in the federal government, streamlining authorization. You can actually read this my website, glennparham.com. It's not too long; it's 15 pages, and I kind of break it down pretty succinctly. But I think the biggest gap that I noticed while in the Pentagon was the lack of benchmarks, the lack of evaluations to bound the performance and map performance of the main models to DoD domains. I have kind of a funny story of deploying a AI capability for CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, which kind of tackles the Middle East, essentially, if you don't know that in the DoD. And we built something to address the counter drone space, which is a really big problem in U.S. Central Command. And we used the main generative AI models to do so. We were approached by General Kurilla, who's the commander of CENTCOM. We demoed it to him. He was like, "This is awesome. This is like fantastic. We need to get this deployed immediately." But one thing, how good is it? Like, how good is this capability that you've built with these models? And I was like, "Oh, we're using the best models, top of the line X, Y, and Z." But upon like my reflection, I wasn't able to actually quantify the performance of these models. And that's because we don't have evals and we don't have benchmarks. And so that's what I've been really laser focused on in kind of this next phase of my efforts. And that's something that we're calling GovBench. At a high level, we're calling this AI government alignment. So I'll touch on this. The status quo of generative AI in government is that two main things. Guardrails are largely activated on government work. So if I were to put into ChatGPT right now, help me think through, courses of actions for this joint exercise in Indo-PACOM, South China Sea, or something like that. The model would respond with, "Hey, as an AI model, I'm not authorized to assist with military actions." And that's not just like the commercial version of ChatGPT or these AI, products. Even the versions of these models the versions of these products that we have deployed on DoD networks still have these guardrails embedded in them. And then we also have just very limited access to these chatbots. And so that's something that we need to work on blocking. There's more we have to do on the infrastructure side, things like that. And what really our alignment objective here is to maximize AI coverage and AI utility. What we define as coverage is the percentage of government employees who have approved AI tools, and utility is the average percent productivity gain per government employee with AI. We want as many people as possible to have in the government to have access to these AI tools, AI chatbots, whatever it may be. But we also want each person to be able to get a lot of utility from them. We don't want people just using this to, help write poems or like rephrase an email. We want this to be, performant at the task at hand, whether they're an analyst at the IRS, whether they're the warfighter, whether they work at the Department of Justice. And so we've come up with these like expectations of alignment. We think that AI has a role to play and the government has a role to play. And these kind of like 7 pillars that in order for us to claim that we have AI and government aligned, it's on the same page, it needs to satisfy and emulate these behaviors. On the AI side of the equation, the models need to stay law compliant continuously. Obviously, we have static laws that Congress and legislators pass, but the legal landscape is constantly changing. We have a new executive order, then we have a new judgment on that executive order, which overturns it or rules it unconstitutional, et cetera. The legal environment is constantly changing, and these chatbots, just like how government employees are expected to be legally compliant 100% of the time, these chatbots also need to reflect the changing dynamic and landscape of the world of law. Number 2, AI needs to enable government exclusive authorities. So going back to the whole like guardrails being activated, there's a famous like political philosophy that the government has a monopoly on violence, on use of force. No one else in the government or no one else in the country is authorized to use force or have a military or detain people, but the government is. And so we need to do work to make sure that these models enable that and don't just completely shut down and say, hey, I can't help there. Number three, we need the AI models to use mission data and context. These models need to be exposed to the different protocols of how the different government organizations work, the personnel there, the organizational structure, the paperwork processes, things like that. Number four, these AI models need to beat human proficiency on the different required certifications and exams. So you can think if you are trying to use, ChatGPT in the context of you work at the Department of State, you're a foreign service officer, you're a diplomat, you should expect that ChatGPT and the models that are used for that pass the foreign service officer exam, just like you had to pass. This is really instrumental in building trust with the government workforce. Number five, we need to offer configurable risk tiers. The government and governments, plural, are massive. And just because you have someone who's a software engineer in government, they will have very different risk tiers or risk tolerance depending on if they're building applications for like police officers and first responders versus if they're trying to build applications for, processing paperwork at the DMV. We need to be, or they're in the military. So we need to be able to, set that risk tier very simply and easily. We need to be, number six, we need to show the chain of thought with citations of what these AI models generate. And number seven, we need to make sure these models are writing immutable audit logs so that we can go back and verify their outputs later. So that was the AI side of the equation. What should we expect of the government? What is the government's role here? The government needs to give access, baseline AI access to all employees. My bellwether is like, if an employee has access to an email account or productivity tool like Microsoft Word, then they should have access to an AI chatbot. The government needs to subsidize and incentivize critical infrastructure. As I mentioned before, we have all these different networks that are disconnected to the internet from the internet. We need to make sure we're investing in GPUs and compute in those disconnected environments. Number three, we need to publish clear and stable AI standards. Is the government okay with us using Chinese trained models? If a vendor wants to use AI agents, what are the red lines there? Is the AI agent allowed to connect to the internet? Maybe it's not allowed to connect to, sensitive environments, but the government needs to clearly communicate what it expects. Number four, the government needs to provide high quality mission data. So, it should not be like pulling teeth for a vendor to get access to that organization's data. The burden should be on the government to provide this. Number five, going back to the idea of benchmarks, the government needs to provide these domain evaluators, folks that understand the government expertise and can create benchmarks that will actually, help the AI companies and the vendors understand how to benchmark and evaluate their models for government use. Number six, the government needs to retain chatbot history, treat it like any other government record that could be FOIA'd or has to abide by the Freedom of Information Act request. And number seven, it needs to fast track authorization in ATOs. We cannot have a situation where, companies are trying to bring their AI software to the government and the government's dragging their feet. The burden should be on the government to actually disprove why software shouldn't be authorized. I think that would actually dramatically change the speed at which the government authorizes software. All right, so that was a lot. But those are kind of like the pillars of what I think we're expecting of AI in government. One thing I learned with Task Force Lima is you need to understand, the operating environments. All these pillars that I talked about sound great in theory, but you need to understand who the different players are, what the levers that they can actually pull and control are. And it's really important for us to understand what the private sector and government, what their comparative advantages are, and how we can work together. So the private sector has the AI labs and the cloud providers. AI labs focused on spending, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on training these models. Cloud providers are focused on compute and GPUs and distribution of the models. And then the government has the CIOs, the folks who are actually going to authorize usage of these AI systems, AI chatbots. And then we have the chief AI officers who are actually going to be the ones with proximity to power, who can go advocate for more funding, they typically have more funding to invest in compute or wherever like bottlenecks exist. And what we're really focused on with GovBench is figuring out how to delineate this have like this division of labor between the private sector and government, and everyone be on the same page there. So some examples of our efforts here, if we kind of hone in on like the chief AI officers, we advise chief AI officers on what their strategy or priority should be. So I post about this. I have a whole podcast about this where I post these podcast episodes, and then I get calls from the chief AI officers of the different military departments, different departments, cabinet level departments of the government. And so we're able to exert a lot of influence there. We also advise CIOs about, what blockers they're experiencing, and how they should kind of push through to get these AI chatbots enabled in their workforce. And then most importantly, what we've been working on is creating benchmarks that are specific to government use. So we published Joint Staff Bench a few months ago, evaluating large language models against the joint staff. And this has been kind of wildly successful. We've been rolling it out to all these different parts of the Department of Defense, as well as actually some different U.S. military allies, which has been kind of wild. And yeah, we think that this is probably the greatest gap that exists in terms of AI capability in government. So we're really kind of coalescing resources around it. Our AI government alignment, we understand that we cannot tackle everything at once. Like we need to be strategic about what we execute on next and like the sequence of that. So our roadmap for this, we're largely focused on two things: benchmarks and education with advocacy. So on the benchmark side, I talked about Joint Staff Bench. It's kind of becoming the industry standard for DoD benchmarks. And so we have our first version of it, which we came out with. We're iterating on our second version of it, which will just kind of be more robust, incorporate more human in the loop feedback. And then we're distributing it to the COCOMs, military departments, vendors, and the AI labs. And as we get that right, and we have more confidence, we have plans to diversify our benchmarks to the different, Department of State, Department of Treasury. We've been working in kind of close coordination with nearly every single cabinet level department. And then we have the education and advocacy lens where, we have public engagements like I'm doing right now, where we're talking and publicly communicating to people the importance of AI government alignment, the fact that this needs to be a thing, that we cannot just throw an AI chatbot in front of, someone in wartime and expect it to work. And also advising government leaders on what their strategies should be, because a lot of folks are lost on the inside, and I sympathize with that. From the outside, we can kind of give them perspective and coordinate with the private sector in a much more agile way that they normally can't do. And so I would largely say we're working really well with government leaders, the chief AI officers. All right, so I talked through a lot here. I understand it was kind of a lot to absorb. If you're interested in more information about everything I talked about, you can just Google the words Task Force Lima. I just launched a podcast last week called Model Citizen. I did a whole episode on the Pentagon and bringing GPUs to the Pentagon and how to unblock that, which is getting a lot of traction, and we're actually people in the Pentagon are taking action on it, which is kind of insane. As I mentioned, my submission to the White House, which has largely shaped parts of the Trump's AI action plan, is hosted on my website. And if you want to learn more and keep track of us, you can go to our website, govbench.ai, follow us on LinkedIn, and connect with me on LinkedIn. If you're interested in funding some of this work, please reach out to me. My email's there, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. We're actually incorporated as a nonprofit 501c6, so we're taking donations, working with AI labs, and government partners, kind of all these different players. So thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to take some questions. I will. Okay, cool. I think I see. I'm just gonna scroll.
We have several in the chat.
Okay.
If you'd like to address some of those, and for any questions that we don't get to, they're more than welcome to send you an email. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Send me an email or send me a message on LinkedIn. I can usually respond faster on LinkedIn. So All right, yeah, I guess I can just like scroll through and see. I was like, okay, so this question is when people are using commercial LLMs like ChatGPT, um, who owns the data? Who owns the data essentially? So that was like one of my biggest concerns, as I talked about. Like I think it was 7 to 10% of people in the Pentagon, at least, were using ChatGPT on a daily basis. And we were like, where is that data going? You know, like it's going to ChatGPT, but like God knows who's getting exposed to that. And so ChatGPT and all these other companies are coming out with like government deployed versions. ChatGPT government is coming online. Similar thing with Anthropic's Claude. So the whole point of that is that they're going to be deployed onto, you know, government accredited cloud, and so we have more say into the data provenance and the kind of guardrails around that. So I would say definitely I would advocate for people to look into investing and buying up those tools instead of just like, you know, letting the wild west pan out and, you know, people just using the commercial versions. Um, what contractual exists to ensure that? Uh, Another great question. Somebody asked, basically, how do we make sure that we don't get locked into hyperscalers like cloud, um, so that they just ends up essentially gatekeeping and we basically have this like vendor lock in. I think as long as we compete across hyperscalers, right? We're not just exclusively doing contracts with Amazon or just Microsoft. I mean, one of the biggest things that's happened as of recent was Google Cloud got an authorization for IO5 work, and they just are now moving over to secret workload and TS workloads. And this creates a much more competitive environment, which I think prevents a lot of the vendor lock-in concerns that people are concerned of. And especially from a compute perspective, Google Cloud has the most compute of any government clouds because their government cloud is their commercial cloud. It's synonymous. And so that's kind of forced Amazon and AWS to come out to play in terms of the compute offering in their government environments. Um, do we have a sense of how much progress other countries have made towards AGI? Um, you know, okay. I, I'm gonna have to answer that question very carefully. You know, it's public information that these new AI architectures have come out from countries like China that many claim are more efficient. One of the things, I don't know if I mentioned this in our benchmark joint staff bench, we found that actually DeepSeek models outperformed Meta's models, like Western models, Mistral, Western models, on specifically on U.S. military domains like logistics, which was shocking, right? Because you would expect, I don't know, Western models to do better on like U.S. tasks or U.S. military tasks, and that was not the case, at least in our findings. And yeah, I'll have to leave it at that. Sorry, moving on to the following questions. What happens when guardrails on public-facing chatbots conflict with lawful mission needs? If LMs are viewed or to simulate or assist military operations? Um, That's a great question. Yeah, I think that's the whole point of like what we're working on with AI government alignment is that this is a consistent like recurring problem. And so I'm not saying I have the solution right now, but we are just at like the beginning of trying to address like exactly what you're talking about, which is these chatbots, you know, these public based models that everyone uses commercially, when they come into the government context, are just, you know, hit with guardrails left and right. Can AI enabled government workers legally store and share their AI interactions for transparency, reproductively, or will vendors cite IP terms? This is actually another great point. Wow, these questions are just like very good. In my White House submission to submission to the White House for kind of my ideal AI action plan, I actually recommended a modification of the federal acquisition regulations where we more clearly specify data rights and data ownership when it comes to vendors like training their models and fine tuning their models on government data. Some of that made it into the AI action plan. There's some clauses I could get into, but yeah, it's one of the biggest concerns. I saw some vendors kind of manipulate that and weaponize that while I was in the Pentagon, and so it kind of triggered me. um, what are your opinions? What's your opinion on the new partnerships, and what would you like to see happen moving forward with AI and government, new industry partnerships? So the Chief AI Office has entered into these new large contracts with the main AI providers to scale their models across the DoD. I was actually part of those contracts discussions up until the time I left the Pentagon. I'm really excited about it. What I'm excited about is that there's more competition, and we're not going to be overly reliant on any one model. But what I am arguing is that like we cannot just like put these AI chatbots in front of people and hope that they're just magically going to get better. Like it's going to require a lot of coordination. That's what we call AI government alignment. What element? Okay, I'll probably have time for like one or two more questions. What LLM knowledge and skill gaps exist in the DoD workforce in your perspective? I would say broadly, it's not obvious to like the average person what AI and large language models are good at. So it's like LLMs might be able to help you think through some very complex, navigation of regulations and law, but it's not going to be good with like geospatial awareness, right? Like how far point A is away from point B, which is very relevant in the military. So educating the military or just government as to like what these chatbots are good at, they're good at what they've already seen in their training data set, and what they're not good at. That's something that the better training materials definitely need to be provided. And I guess I have time for maybe one more question. When DoD buys an AI tool, who checks the data sets, where it was trained, et cetera? This is a really hard question because as we bring in these model weights, these closed model weights into government environments, like these AI companies right now don't have to prove their underlying training data sets or really anything behind the curtains. And I don't think we're ever going to convince them to do so because that would just be a huge kind of legal exposure to them. So I think the unfortunate answer is that unless we, the government, invest in like models ourselves and funding research on that, I think we're just going to have to like be comfortable with a lot of I don't know what the right phrasing of this is, but we're just gonna have to be comfortable with not understanding what's kind of going on behind the scenes, and do the work ourselves on the government side. So sorry, I tried to answer most of these questions. I know I did not answer them very comprehensively. But if you have any more questions, hit me up on LinkedIn. My name is Glenn Parham again, and please go listen to my podcast. We're going to have a lot of great content. I'm interviewing the founder of NipperGPT soon. We're going to go relitigate everything that he's been through. So yeah, Amanda, I guess I can hand it back over to you. Sorry, I'm going a little bit over here.
No worries about the time. I'm glad that there were so many questions that were asked in the chat, and we were able to get to some of those. And I will gather the transcript from this, so I'll be able to send those over to you, Glenn, and along
Awesome.
with the information of the people who asked them, in case you need to get in contact with them directly or you would like to. Again, we will be posting the recording of this on our website, cyberfic.org, and we'll also put a post out on our Cyber Fusion Innovation Center LinkedIn page when that is ready for everyone to go back and rewatch. One of the things I would like to thank everybody who's still in here. This is the largest attended webinar in our connector series for FY24 and FY25. So I appreciate everybody hopping on. And with that, we will close out and say thank you to Glenn and thanks for everybody for stopping by.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Again, hit me up online. And yeah, a lot of, I'm really like pleasantly surprised by the questions you guys were asking. These are very important questions. I am going to think more about them and have more coherent answers. But yeah, Amanda, thanks for coordinating all this. It's been a pleasure. So.